I guess it's pretty timely, this event, because tomorrow, Liverpool City Council will be launching a programme that should take a number of years towards becoming a child-friendly city. And the Child Friendly City scheme is a UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund scheme, that seeks to enable cities and communities to embrace a children's rights-based approach to everything that it does, to the delivery of its services, to the way that children are heard, to the way that its schools are delivered, to the way that its cities are designed, to the way that public spaces are made available. But I guess that kind of prompts a really serious look at what children's rights really mean. And if we didn't have children's rights, what would this community look like? We know that human rights in particular, have been seriously undermined as a result of Brexit. But children's rights in particular have failed to achieve the advancements in children's rights, children's lives, that other emancipatory, including women's movements, have achieved. So, how do we test this? How do we test the currency of rights, and particularly the currency of children's rights? Well, I think there's nothing like a global economic crisis to test our commitment to rights, and particularly to children's rights. And it's been just over a decade since the financial crash. And it's fair to say that most states have failed absolutely spectacularly in protecting children, not least in the most developed economies. Around 77 million children live in poverty in the 41 richest countries in this world. Children's well-being, including in this country, is particularly compromised by growing obesity rates among 11 to 15-year-olds in particular, rocketing mental health problems among adolescents. In the UK, and particularly in Liverpool, infant mortality rates are on the increase. I think in Liverpool it's got the highest infant mortality rate in the whole of Europe. 7 in every 1,000 children in Liverpool die before the age of 1. Now, compounding that situation are widespread cuts in our public services and welfare budgets, especially those relevant to children and young people. Since 2012, spending on children and young people's services in particular has been cut by nearly £1 billion. And that has led to a withdrawal of preventative support for the poorest, a massive increase in referrals to child protection and other crisis services. And you will know about this, Jeannie. Now, let's set aside for a moment the fact that the austerity measures have been disproportionately regressive for women and children compared to any other group. We accept that difficult decisions, and often painful decisions, have to be made about where we invest scant public resources. We need to achieve the best possible outcomes for the greatest number of people. So what guides decision-making in that regard? It's certainly not a desire to fulfil our international children's rights obligations. It comes down to economics. It comes down to demonstrating that we can get the best value for money for the greatest proportion of voters if we invest in particular sites. Now, in particular, the UK government strongly encourages public services to engage with cost-benefit analysis models to ensure that best value for money when it's allocating public funding. Cost-benefit analysis has become the normal model for allocating public funding. Now, let's apply this then to children. All of the research tells us that the earlier public investment occurs, the less likely that adverse conditions like poverty, substance abuse, disability, parental neglect can hijack an individual's life's opportunities. The less likely those kinds of adverse circumstances can entrench very negative patterns of behaviour and perpetuate this kind of intergenerational transmission of deprivation. Research is completely unequivocal on that point, and it's abundant. The research also tells us that particularly vulnerable groups should be prioritised when it comes to investing public funding, because the longer term effects and costs of leaving those groups untreated are significantly greater. So, for example, looked after children. About 90 children enter the care system every day in England and Wales. Now, we're with a care system that's at a record high at the moment. Those children in care are 5 times more likely to be cautioned or convicted of a criminal offence than children in the general population. And research tells us then that if those services had intervened early for just 1 in 10 of those young people sentenced to prison every year, public services could save over £100 million annually just through early intervention. Now, that kind of evidence points to some potential solution. Why don't we prioritise children's services over all other kinds of services? But it also points to lots of questions. If cost-benefit analysis is so firmly entrenched in the way that we allocate public money, and if the evidence is telling us that early intervention is the best, investment in children's services is the best, why, in this era of austerity, continuing austerity, have children borne the brunt of our public services cuts? Surely cost-benefit analysis should come into its own. Surely our children should be thriving if we know that early investment reaps rewards for a greater number of people. So I think we need to kind of have a little critical look at cost-benefit analysis as a basis for this and start thinking about the currency of rights instead. So let's think about kind of how we get best value for money. Public expenditure is about containing costs as much as about getting value for money. But it's also about advancing a political narrative. It has virtually nothing to do with respecting human rights, least of all children's rights. You talk to politicians about children's rights, they roll their eyes. I remember I was involved in a House of Lords inquiry into the plight of unaccompanied children across the UK, and I was their special advisor. And the one piece of advice I had at the beginning of the inquiry was, don't mention children's rights. Talk about children's well-being and welfare, but don't mention rights. There's a real hostility towards rights. Let's have a look at how that's played out then. If we take, for instance, Labour's landmark Tough on Crime, Tough on the Causes of Crime from the early 1990s. Now that's contributed to a staggering growth in custodial sentences, both in proportion and length, and during New Labour's subsequent administration. So by 2010, the prison population in England and Wales had doubled over the course of 30 years, creating one of the highest incarceration rates in the EU. And child offenders were amongst the worst affected by that penalisation policy, despite clear evidence that incarceration of children is ineffective in reducing crime. It's ineffective in rehabilitating children. Now, that was one strategy. There was a political strategy, but the soaring costs of that strategy brought in this new approach, particularly once the global recession took hold. So, faced with the demands to reduce public spending, and given that it costs over £200,000 a year to keep a child in custody, an obvious and easy target for the Ministry of Justice was to reduce the number of young people in prison. Fantastic news for children's rights campaigners, fantastically cost effective, everybody's a winner. So since the beginning of the recession, the number of first-time entrants into the youth justice system has fallen by 85%. 81% fewer young people have been placed in custody or received a caution. Great. So what's happened to those young people? Have we invested in those other welfare services to enable them to be supported onto a better life trajectory? Instead, we don't have anything. We have a policy that has been driven by a desire to lower the national deficit rather than to really address what is affecting these children and young people. So we end up with thousands and thousands of young people without any support whatsoever who are at risk of further exploitation, further criminalisation, further social and economic marginalisation. Let's look as well at some of the welfare to work policies and how they have affected children and women in particular. The last 10 years have seen a withdrawal of benefits from lone parents for children under 3 years old, the introduction of the welfare benefits cap, the confinement of welfare claims to the first 2 children to the exclusion of any other children that families might have. And all of those so-called welfare to work measures have plunged an estimated 40,000 more children in England into poverty, rendered twice as many children as adults more vulnerable to eviction. So, if we look at all of those policies, it's perhaps not surprising that our children's rights, those that are contained in this UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that will frame our Child-Friendly City initiative, do not feature at all in any of those policy debates and decisions. Children's best interests, children's rights to life, survival and development, children's right to be cared for by their parents, children's right to the highest attainable standard of health, children's right to adequate physical, mental, spiritual, moral and social development, all of those rights, they all impose legally binding obligations on our state authorities and do not feature one jot in any of those public resource allocation decisions. Such obligations might as well not exist. I think a further objection that I have to basing the resourcing decisions around children's services on this cost-benefit model is this inevitable tendency to pitch children as market entities, to be bought and sold, haggled over. In the process, children's rights are subject to a much more market-driven agenda. Profit margins, value for money are the dominant driving force in this very neoliberalised course of action, not children's rights and well-being. So we've seen this shift in the role of local government agencies from being public service providers to commissioners and regulators. Competitive tendering, performance indicator targets have all become the name of the game. So if we look at early years daycare, for instance, more than 90% of early years daycare is provided by for-profit providers and third sector providers. It's not provided by not-for-profit agencies. Child protection and youth justice are similarly effective. Profit-making service providers offer the majority of custodial, residential and foster care provision, often at considerable profit. So if we take children's social work and mental health services, for instance, they are now routinely outsourced to profit-making private providers. Virgin Care runs 21 primary care services across England, including contracts for children's public health nursing, child and adolescent mental health services, services for disabled children and their families. G4S has contracts for the forensic examination of children who may have been sexually abused, and it has expanded into the provision of residential children's homes. The number of privately owned children's homes has now increased year on year, so that 73% of all active children's homes in England are now owned by private providers, profit-making companies. One of the effects of that is that we see the government and government agencies placing the delivery of these, responsibility for the delivery of these services at arm's length. They're increasingly distanced in terms of accountability for these services, and we see a proliferation of claims for negligence and deaths in custody of children at the hands of these private providers. So I guess, where does all this take us? Is there any scope for developing a system of children's service budgeting that is driven by rights rather than costs? I would argue that there absolutely is. In fact, I would go as far as saying that the public investment in children's rights on a sustained basis is essential, not simply in spite of the economic climate, but as one of the best means of repairing and sustaining it. So I am convinced that those with responsibility for allocating public resources need to be convinced themselves that investment in children's rights is assigned economic investment, that it's actually the only economic investment. But the problem is that hard facts and figures speak to politicians, not children's rights aspirations. Mainstream economists who are charged with doing all of this rarely, if ever, operate within a children's rights paradigm, in the same way that children's rights activists, human rights activists, rarely operate within an economic paradigm. They are notoriously uneasy bedfellows. But there are some good examples of how a rights-based approach, taking rights as your starting point rather than the chance outcome, to public budgets could work really well in practice. So, for instance, there was a report by UNICEF UK and the Children's Society a couple of years ago that assessed the costs and financial benefits of providing proper guardianship support for unaccompanied children. There are an estimated 3,000 who'd arrived into the UK that year. And what they did is they took as their starting point international children's rights law. And international children's rights law says that we have to provide proper guardianship for all unaccompanied children who enter this country. Now, what that report estimated was that the annual cost of funding those positions, proper guardians for unaccompanied children, would be about £4,892 per child per year. And that every £1 spent on that system would actually reap a benefit of £2.39. Of this, about half of that income would come from reduced spending on legal challenges and appeals in the asylum process. That's about £27 million a year. Insofar as the guardian would ensure that the child was fully informed of the legal options available to him and her, and would facilitate that child's access to the most appropriate legal advice and representation. Now, that intelligence has informed the establishment of a really successful legal guardianship scheme in Scotland with unaccompanied children seeking asylum. That has been a resounding economic and social success and a model of good practice. So on a more global scale, and to end where I began, UNICEF's Child Friendly Cities initiative is already yielding strong evidence that localised investment in building sound public services based on children's rights principles reaps significant economic and social benefits, not just for children, but for communities in general. So I guess the challenge for us tonight is to really seize this opportunity in Liverpool, make sure that we can use this as a microcosm for some bigger experimentation, and really see how we can invest our faith in children's services. Thank you.